Welcome back to the Deal Mastery Insider. Today, I want to unpack something that I'm still kind of mind blown about, honestly. The math on this is crazy, and I've done a bunch of research. You can see a bunch of my sources here. We've got the SBA, the census, like some pretty reasonable resources that I've done a lot of homework around this on. But the silver tsunami, you've probably heard the term. You've heard people throw around phrases like there's $10 trillion of value that's going to be transferred from the baby boomer generation to the next generations as they buy baby boomer businesses. I wanted to unpack and actually understand what the private business ecosystem in the US looks like, how many of those businesses are owned by baby boomers, and how that impacts the average M&A transaction volumes per year over the next 10 or 20 years as baby boomers retire. And the punchline is the math on this is wild. Like I'm blown away, honestly. And I'm going to show you the assumptions. I'm going to show you the calculations, and we'll get into this. But this is pretty crazy. So just starting out really basically, if we look at the number of total private businesses in the US, and I did a bunch of research on this, the numbers vary a little bit, but generally this seems to be kind of roughly where the data sits. And this pyramid here, I've presented everything. It's not to scale, just to be clear. Obviously, 27 million is not scaled with 3 million, et cetera. But I think visually this helps kind of represent the size and scope of the different businesses as that are part of the total private company ecosystem in the United States. So to start, there are roughly, based on the data I looked at, there are roughly 33 million private businesses across the US. Now, the vast majority of those businesses, 27 million of those, are sole proprietorships or businesses with less than one employee. Right? So basically sole proprietorships. So the huge bulk of businesses in general are basically one person as a sole proprietor. And then, unsurprisingly, the bigger the company gets, the fewer private companies exist in each of those buckets. So if you go to 1 to 4 employees, there's about 3.8 million businesses in the US that have 1 to 4 employees. There's about 1 million businesses that have 5 to 9. There's 630,000 that have 10 to 20. And on, right? And so we can see 500 and up, there's only 20,000 private businesses that have more than 500 employees in the US, which is still a huge number. If you think about how many 20,000 businesses is, it's massive. But I think this is a really cool, almost shows the power law or the 80-20 principle of size. You can see that generally speaking, most businesses are actually sole proprietorships, the vast majority of them. And the larger you go, the smaller the ecosystem gets. But I want to cross-apply this with baby boomer ownership and get a sense of whether or not how many baby boomers own this pool of businesses and how many of those are going to trade over the next 10 or 20 years as baby boomers retire and leave the workplace. So let's look at the baby boomer ownership stats. I'm going to show you some of these sources. Again, I have all my sources listed here. I was also pretty skeptical of this number. 50% of businesses generally are owned by baby boomers. We'll look at a couple scenarios to see whether that 50% number is realistic, or even if it's not realistic, what it would look like if it was higher, if it was lower, et cetera. But suffice it to say, there's a ton of data out there and resources, and we'll cut over to Google here in a second just to give you a quick peek that pretty robustly support this 50% number. In fact, I've seen some folks say as high as 60% of all private businesses are owned by baby boomers, right? Which is pretty staggering. Well, let's cut over. We'll look at Google really quickly, and then we'll come back and we'll run these numbers. So we're not going to unpack in great detail these data sources, but I just wanted to show you really quickly. If you just Google what percentage of businesses are owned by baby boomers, we can see here Forbes estimates 40%, study 51%, right here. 83% of those are expected to change hands in the next 5 to 10 years. So we'll look at that data in a second. Right here, around 50.9% of small businesses in the US are owned by baby boomers. Right here, we can see approximately 60% businesses owned by baby boomers. And so you can see the numbers move around a little bit, 40 to 60. 70% of these companies are expected to change hands, which is more than 12 million private businesses. Baby boomers make up about 40% of small business ownership, 51% of privately held businesses. And so you can see the data moves around. We don't need to go and unpack all of these. I think as a rough estimate, we can look at a range from 40 to 60% to see of all of those businesses, the ones that are baby boomer owned, what does it look like if they actually change hands? All right, so we're back in Excel. Let's look at this. We'll start with a midpoint of 50%. That means that we have about 16 million sole proprietorships that are, 13 million that are sole proprietorships, 16 million total businesses owned by baby boomers. And you can see the cascade here of how many of these other firms would be at a 50% mark. So let's run that through and make a couple other assumptions that start to get really, really interesting. So if we assume a 50% rate, we can go as low as 40%, which is sort of what some of the data was saying. We could go as high as 60%, but let's just start with 50 as a midpoint just to see. I made two other assumptions here that I think are important. One is, how many years is it going to take all of these baby boomer businesses to transact one way or another, right? So we saw some estimates there that 70 to 80% of them are expected to transact in the next 5 to 10 years. I've used 20 years here as a time horizon to say it's going to take a little longer, but we'll say on average, all of these businesses over the next 20 years have to transact or divest or change hands or close in some form or fashion. So basically what that means is I've divided this number by 20 to say how many of those per year on average are going to trade over the next 10 or 20 years, or the next 20 years in this case, since we're using 20 years as the time horizon, right? The other assumption I've made is that not all of these businesses are going to be marketable or buyable or desirable for buyers, right? And so this is a guess, right? And this is a thought exercise more than anything else. So I've looked at I made an assumption 20% of those businesses are marketable and actually will trade hands, which means I'm assuming 80% of those baby boomer businesses, which I think is a pretty conservative assumption, will not trade, will close, will shut down, and not really have interested buyers. Now, if we really wanted to get fancy, we could probably make some assumptions by firm type, i.e. sole proprietorships. Probably more of those will be unmarketable or closed than, let's say, 10 to 20 employee companies or 100 to 49 employee companies, etc. So having said that, I didn't break it down by company type, but if you wanted to do the math, you could certainly get a little more creative and go deeper and do that. I've just used 20% as a blanket placeholder here. So what we get here is this deals per year number, which I think is really interesting. And it's basically just taking, hey, we have this many baby boomer owned businesses. So there's 33 million in the US. Baby boomers own 50% of all businesses based on our rough assumptions. That means there's 16 million privately held businesses. If we assume that it takes them 20 years to sell through all of those businesses, right? So we divide that number by 20, and only 20% of those businesses are actually really marketable. Per year, that would mean around 166,000 businesses would trade hands that would be baby boomer owned. Hopefully you're tracking with me on that math. So if we break that down just by type of business, we can see here, same math here. We've got 135,000 sole proprietorships transacting annually over the next 20 years. We've got about 20,000 1 to 4 employee firms, 5,000 5 to 9 employee firms, 3,000 10 to 19 employee firms, etc. Right, all the way down to the 500 plus. There's about 100 more of those. So that's interesting, right? And I mean, the bulk of these are sole proprietorships, but as we can see, that's about 166,000 businesses per year for the next 20 years that need to trade hands. Putting that in context, how many businesses trade hands on average today? Well, you can look at some different data sets. There's a few different assumptions out there. I've seen numbers as high as 30 or 35,000. I've seen numbers as low as 20,000. So I took the low here to say, hey, if we assume current M&A transaction volume is about 20,000 businesses transacting per year, right? That means that the new volume for the next 20 years as baby boomers begin to retire and put these businesses on the market is going to be 186,000 businesses, up from an average about 20,000. So that's an 830% increase in M&A transaction volume. That's 166,000 deals every year for the next 20 years as these businesses transact. And that's assuming 20% of those businesses actually trade and 80% of them don't. And that's assuming it takes 20 years. So if we assume it only takes 15 years, right? And let's say 35% of those businesses are actually marketable. Suddenly we're at 400,000 additional businesses transacting annually every year for the next 15 years over a 20K base, which is almost a 20x increase in deal flow. It's staggering. It's crazy, right? Now, okay, we take a conservative approach. Let's say it takes 25 years and maybe only 15% of those businesses are really marketable and only 40% of businesses are owned by baby boomers. We're only seeing a 400% increase in deal flow over the next 20 years. or the next 25 years in this case, right? Which is about 80,000 additional deals per year, bringing us from 20,000 a year to 100,000 a year. This is what I'm saying when I said earlier, the math on this is crazy, right? I mean, you can use some pretty conservative assumptions here and still see that no matter how you slice and dice it, the amount of baby boomer owned businesses that will trade hands over the next 10, 15, 20, 25 years, even if it's only a fraction of those, is going to be a tremendous tidal wave of deal flow and a huge $1 trillion plus value transfer. So I wanted to share this math with you. Hopefully this entices you to think about why buying businesses and mergers and acquisitions can be such a powerful growth strategy. The last thing I'll point out here really quickly is if you just look at sole proprietorships, right? And we've talked on Deal Mastery Insider a bunch about things like business giveaways and acqui-hire deals. A lot of these sole proprietorships are going to have no alternative other than to close. And there's going to be a ton of opportunity to scoop up deals in your industry by finding sole proprietors who are going out of business and doing these really easy, very cash and equity light acquisitions where you just basically onboard their book of business for an earnout. So there's a lot of opportunity for that. But this math is wild. I wanted to show you the math. I wanted to show you the assumptions. If you have different numbers and you want to challenge some of this thinking, help me think about how this is possible, because it seems staggering how big these numbers are. So I'd love your perspective. I'd love your opinion. Thank you again for checking out the Deal Mastery Insider, and I'll see you on the next edition.